Constance Marten, in The Predator's Grip, Part 4. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. You've listened to the circumstances of the tragic case of the death of baby Victoria, neglected by her parents. This wasn't a one-off. You have heard of a repeated pattern of neglect in relation to the other children who were taken into care. The almost laissez-faire attitude adopted by Constance Marten and Mark Gordon in respect of their behaviour towards children, their itinerant lifestyle, their attempt to evade authority, and all-pervading mistrust of authority. You've heard about the criminal activity, serious criminal activity, again, about Mark Gordon, which of course demonstrates an absence of emotional empathy on his part, which therefore makes it fairly easy to reconcile in your mind why he would neglect a child. But what about Constance Marten? This makes it an altogether more complicated situation concerning her. On the one hand, you have heard how many people spoke about her being a lovely, kind, bubbly person, albeit a little bit disorganised, that she was easily persuaded to undertake this sort of hippie lifestyle, something which often occurs where somebody born into a life of privilege decides that they're essentially going to rebel against it, having no real idea of how the world works because everything has been offered on a plate. It would certainly seem the case that she would exhibit emotional empathy from the descriptions that people have made in respect of their dealings with her. Furthermore, you didn't hear anything that would particularly appertain to her behaving like a narcissist, and yet the mother of a child allowed her child to be neglected so that she died. And she showed neglectful behaviours in relation to 3 other children. She showed a flagrant disregard for the lives of those children by getting pregnant so readily, by failing to undertake antenatal checks, by bringing them up in an environment which clearly wasn't conducive to a healthy lifestyle, living in places that were less than desirable, moving around. And therefore, you would then query, might she really have emotional empathy if this is the way that she behaves? There appears to be a considerable clash. On the one hand, her behaviour previously supports the presence of emotional empathy, but her behaviour towards the children, and particularly in relation to baby Victoria, supports an absence of emotional empathy. Furthermore, what caused her to be so susceptible? Because what is evident is that there is a clear before and after in relation to her behaviours. That she behaved in a particularly different way once she became involved with Mark Gordon. And this is something that is commonly seen, where individuals are drawn into the world of another person who is disordered and harmful, so that not only do they harm that individual, but they cause that person to start to act in a completely different way. I've seen this many times with people who are the victims of narcissists and psychopaths, that their own behaviour and values alter, that they become somebody else. And it's because, in effect, they've fallen under the spell of the disordered individual, and so to such a great extent that it results in their personality being altered, their emotional empathy being eroded, and awful consequences following thereon. To comprehend how Marten fell so deeply into Gordon's orbit, it's important to examine her susceptibility. Her susceptibility wasn't something that she was born with, it was forged. First of all, she was born into an opulent world of the British aristocracy. She lived in a Georgian mansion set amid 5,000 acres of parkland. It symbolised privilege. She had almost idyllic life. On the one hand, you might think that that would generate an entitled approach. But given the way that people spoke about her, that she was likeable, easygoing, pleasant, kind, etc., it would appear that rather than foster an entitled attitude, it created naivety. She wasn't worldly wise, that she had no real understanding of the way that the world worked. And when she was 9, her world cracked when her father underwent a midlife awakening. As you'll recall, her father Napier, heeding inner voices, shaved his head, abandoned his family and fled to Australia to pursue whale watching and tree surgery. For young Constance, this abandonment instilled a deep-seated sense of instability. She will have internalized this loss as a personal failing, fostering a need for belonging that a predator would exploit. Her empathic traits, her kindness, a spiritual side, were evident early on. And as a consequence of this, she had a glaring vulnerability generated by the abandonment of her father. But then this vulnerability was heightened. And the pivotal vulnerability emerged in 2006 at age 19, when she travelled to Nigeria and joined the Synagogue Church of All Nations, SCOAN, under the infamous T.B. Joshua. What began as a spiritual quest devolved into a cult-like nightmare. Joshua, dubbed Daddy by followers, isolated disciples, deprived them of sleep, starved their self-worth and subjected them to abuse. Marten endured 3 months in this compound, experiencing what her family described as bizarre and damaging ordeals. Friends noticed 2 versions of Constance, the vibrant one before Nigeria and the profoundly changed one thereafter. Essentially, the abandonment by her father and the trauma of her experience in Nigeria shattered her boundaries, leaving her with post-traumatic stress disorder and the vulnerabilities that come with that. This manifested as shame, silence, and most of all, a pattern of seeking saviours by way of controlling figures. It exposed her to be easy to manipulate. She exhibits codependent traits, craving validation while fearing abandonment, making her a prime target for ensnarement. And then enter Mark Gordon. You have an individual who has clearly exhibited emotional empathy in the past from what people have described about her, but she has been scarred by her father's abandonment, which causes her then to regard herself as a failure, and then fostering a need for belonging, and then the post-traumatic stress disorder that arose as a consequence of her abuse in Nigeria, which left her open and vulnerable to seeking being saved by a controlling figure. In effect, she delegates responsibility to that other individual, which of course a predator is going to readily exploit as a consequence of their own absence of emotional empathy and the ease by which this individual is handing themselves on a plate. Mark Gordon committed a heinous rape. He engaged in physical assault. He demonstrates impulsive violence, a lack of remorse, crude control targets. Marten, traumatized, estranged from her family due to her rebellion and seeking purpose, well, Gordon appeared as the soulmate. He will have love-bombed her. Declarations of undying love, shared adventures, and a narrative of mutual victimhood against societal judgment, which has fostered whereby his own paranoia, as a consequence of the threat to control that exists from authority, was imbued in her, resulting in her agreeing that they would not embrace societal infrastructures, meaning that she wouldn't undertake antenatal checks, that she distrusted hospitals. In effect, he had a pathological rejection of such institutions by virtue of what he is, and he then infected Marten with that view, and because she was so impressionable, so open to a supposed saviour, that she accepted what he said and went along with it and believed it also. Gordon, with his prison scars and outsider status, in effect mirrored Marten's post-Nigeria alienation. She called him Daddy Bear, a term echoing the cult leader's paternal control, revealing her transference of vulnerability. This made it all easier for Gordon to control her. He bound her through reproduction. Marten's family disapproved, viewing him as a threat. Her father's pleas highlighted the estrangement, but Gordon framed it as prejudice against his background, which she, as a kind person, fell for his lies and supported him. He eroded her support network, which, as you know, is a classic control mechanism to prevent escape. They used fake identities. He assaulted 2 female police officers, revealing his volatility. Social services intervened, deeming the environment unsafe owing to his history and their transient lifestyle. 4 children were removed, which fueled Marten's paranoia of state theft, which was stoked regularly by Gordon. Gordon exploited this, positioning himself as her protector against external threats, binding her to him through shared grievances. The pregnancies were a weapon. Children, as you know, are an extension of control, utilised for leverage and fuel sources. Marten bore 5 children in quick succession, each reinforcing dependence to Gordon. Gordon's insistence on off-grid living, evading rent, bouncing between properties, devalued her further, stripped her of stability. The trust fund provided funds, but he dictated their use. Thousands on taxis during flights, yet scant spent on essentials. This financial control is another form of abuse, reducing her to a puppet. Her empathic nature compelled her to try and save him, and ignored all of the various red flags. Her trauma from Nigeria amplified this. Having escaped one controller, she subconsciously sought out another to fix her unresolved pain. The tragic apex came with baby Victoria. Fearing removal like their other children, they fled off-grid. This was Gordon's ultimate manipulation. They crisscrossed England, Bolton, Liverpool, Harwich, London, Colchester, Brighton, spending lavishly on evasion, but neglecting Victoria's needs. Living in a flimsy tent on the South Downs amid winter freezes, Victoria died, likely from hypothermia. Marten claimed she blacked out while holding the baby, waking to find her lifeless. They stashed the body in a little bag amid rubbish in a shed, which demonstrates the child was just viewed as disposable, and certainly of no use to a predator such as Gordon. Gordon's influence is evident in Marten's denial. During their trial, she exhibited defiant bravado, yawning, arguing the state was responsible, lashing out at journalists for not telling the truth to power. This, of course, is her blaming external forces for internal failings, which is mirroring the way that a narcissist would behave. Gordon, self-representing, demonstrating grandiosity, complained of being treated like monsters, extracting sympathy, even in court. The impact on Marten's profound, a systematic demolition of self. Once a vibrant individual, journalist for Al Jazeera, actress in training, world traveller, she now languishes in prison, estranged, childless and shamed. Her susceptibility, abandonment by her father, cult trauma, made her crave the false security that Gordon offered. He ensured that he was able to control her and manipulate her. What is Mark Gordon? Well, clearly, given his criminal conduct, there was evidence of conduct disorder before he was 15 years of age. Since then, he has repeatedly exhibited a failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviours. He has repeatedly performed acts that are grounds for arrest in relation to the neglect of children, the assault of police officers. He is deceitful. He's engaged in repeated lying. There's been the use of an alias. He's sought to con people for personal profit. He's exhibited impulsivity with regard to the poor decision-making that he has shown surrounding the situation concerning his children, bringing them up in an environment whereby it was less than healthy for them. He's exhibited aggressiveness, which is indicated by physical violence towards Constance Marten, towards the police officers, towards the individuals in the United States. He's shown reckless disregard for the safety of others, particularly the children. He's exhibited consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by his repeated failures to, for instance, hold down a job, to provide a stable background for his children, and there is a complete absence of remorse. He is an individual which fits the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. He exhibits a skittishness and an irritability and what was almost seen as a form of anxiety. And therefore, along the branch of antisocial personality disorder, I wouldn't place him as a psychopath, but more likely a sociopath. He will certainly have narcissistic traits, but I don't see him as a narcissist, chiefly as a consequence of the fact that he doesn't appear to have a huge requirement for fuel, given the loner lifestyle that has been adopted, which was shown with regard to his retreat into his bedroom when he was a teenager, which of course is typical of many teenagers, but that was maintained thereafter as a consequence of the fact that he didn't want Constance Marten dealing with anybody other than him. He didn't have any friends. They went off grid. They led an isolated lifestyle, which isn't supportive, ultimately, of someone with a repeated need for fuel. He similarly doesn't demonstrate particular grandiosity in relation to his behaviours either. And therefore, in respect of Mark Gordon, I would reach the conclusion that he fits the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, has narcissistic traits but isn't a narcissist, and the outcome for him, given the level of impulsivity, anxiety that was exhibited, skittishness, etc., that sociopath would be the appropriate outcome for him. In relation to Constance Marten, it's clear that she was an individual that was imbued with emotional empathy. Her previous history supports that. Whilst many people may find it very difficult to reconcile that such a person could allow her children to be treated in such a way and allow the neglect to occur, the fact is that she is an individual who is deeply flawed and highly vulnerable. That as a consequence of the abandonment by her father and the post-traumatic stress disorder, which has been diagnosed by experts who have analysed her, it's evident that those two factors have worked to, one, make her entirely vulnerable and susceptible to a predator of the nature of Gordon, and two, act to reduce her emotional empathy. Further, the involvement of an individual such as Gordon, who portrayed himself as a saviour, meant that she became beholden to him. Coerced and managed by the use of physical violence, the threat of physical violence, the isolation from networks, he in effect became her world. He became the god that dictated what they ought to do. She may well have thought it wrong. She may well have argued against it. We don't know for certain if there's any evidence to support that. But even if she had, it was ultimately futile because she was under the control of this individual. And whilst there will still be some that would say, but yes, even then you would still fight to protect your children. Not everybody finds themselves in that situation. That there are certain hapless individuals who do have emotional empathy, but as a consequence of the trauma that they have experienced, in her instance, twofold, that emotional empathy becomes eroded so that she is left in a situation whereby she becomes a puppet of the predator, an extension of the abuser, and goes along with what he wants, her mind altered and fostered by the diktats and tenets that he lives by. Accordingly, my conclusion is that Mark Gordon is a sociopath, that Constance Marten is most likely a normal who does have emotional empathy, but has post-traumatic stress disorder, and as a consequence of the abandonment of her father and the abuse that she experienced in Nigeria that created her post-traumatic stress disorder, this impacted on her ability to care for children and also made her highly susceptible to a predator such as Mark Gordon. That once she came within his ambit, it resulted in behaviours which caused her to fall way short of those expected of a parent, resulting in the ultimate tragedy that you've heard about. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.